Hello and welcome back to Underlab. We know so little about Frisk, despite playing as them the entire game. I've gone over various details to do with the character already, but I'd like to bring everything together in one video and try to answer some questions. Where does Frisk come from? Are they real, or are they just a projection of the player? Could Chara or Kara somehow be linked to everything we do within Undertale, despite supposedly being dead for many years? Well, there's only one way to find out, and so I'm going to use everything we know and all we can speculate on in order to try and build a clearer picture of who Frisk is. So without waiting any longer, let's explore the human's origin. One major detail I've been over a few times in the past is that the introduction sequence at the beginning of the game tells us nothing about Frisk. This slideshow in fact depicts Chara, the original fallen human who befriended Asriel. Some of the details that indicate this are the single stripe along the human shirt and the fact that the story is continued during the fight with Asriel, where we learn the missing parts of Chara's story. The images used during that part of the fight clearly seem to portray the character we see during the introduction, and we know for a fact by that point that it's supposed to be Chara. So really, we don't even know how Frisk came to be within the underground. We don't know with absolute certainty that they fell down like Chara did, and really we have no idea what their motive for going down there might be. As I went over in my video called What Happened to Frisk at the End of the Pacifist route, we're given two major choices at the end of the game. One is whether we'll serve as an ambassador between humans and monsters, and the other is if we'll go to live with Toriel or whether we have places to be. Well, it seems like the player is the one deciding the human's backstory here. Surely the fact that we can choose whether we have places to be indicates that Frisk does actually come from somewhere. We seem to simply be making a decision whether Frisk returns to their family or not. It seems then that while the game does tell us a few details about Frisk's past, there's very little to actually go off. That is of course if we don't factor Chara into the equation. Chara seemingly has no relation to Frisk other than finding themselves underground like their yellow counterpart did. At least that's how it seems unless we complete the genocide path. At the very end of the evil optional route, Chara appears to come back to life before explaining that we're somehow responsible for their resurrection. This really doesn't add up all things considered because their presence has been completely absent throughout the entire game. Then there's another bizarre detail. We only ever find out that the human's name is Frisk on the true pacifist path. Otherwise, if we don't know better, we're led to assume that we named them at the beginning of the game, when really we were giving Chara, the fallen child, a name. Could it be that there's a reason for this? Are we really playing as Frisk on the neutral and genocide paths of the game? Why else is the name only revealed to us if we pacify monster kind rather than killing them? As I explained in my video on Frisk's apparent ability to time travel, it seems that some sort of connection has been established between Chara and Frisk. While I explained in that video that it could explain how Frisk is able to reload time, could it go even further? Are we in fact Chara, the fallen human, throughout the entirety of Undertale? While it may seem unbelievable, let me try to explain. Firstly, we have to consider that Chara's soul is apparently nowhere to be found. I've speculated that it could be the strange red soul we see within the true laboratory. What naturally doesn't make sense is that we're led to believe that human souls never disappear, except Chara's soul is inexplicably missing, as surely it could be used alongside the other 6 in order to break the barrier. As we know from the coffins within Asgore's basement, Chara's soul was red like our own. What if there aren't two different souls, however? What if Frisk and Chara's soul are one and the same? While it might not seem like it makes much sense, there's a few things you have to consider. As one of my head scientists, Sophronius, pointed out to me, determination appears to prevent you from committing suicide. We know that Flowey is full of the stuff, and it stops him from being able to end his own life. We also aren't sure of Frisk's motive for entering Mount Ebott, but we do know that the place is renowned for being somewhere where people go missing. Asriel seems to hint that it could have been suicide. Frisk must have had no determination before jumping underground if this was the case, as otherwise they would have stopped themselves, but they didn't as we wake up in the first room, proving that Frisk took the plunge some way or another. That must mean the determination we cling to throughout the game isn't coming from Frisk. That begs the question then of just where exactly Frisk acquired this newfound determination. Perhaps it came from Chara. It seems like Chara was a pretty determined individual. Not long after falling underground, they'd already made a plan to escape by merging their soul with Asriel's. The only question that remains is how did Frisk and Chara become one and the same? It may very well be as simple as the fact that we took control of Frisk when they entered Mount Ebott. As I mentioned in the time travel video, Frisk is called main Chara within the game's files. As many players have noticed, Chara is an abbreviation of character, and so it seems that the main character of Undertale has gone from being Chara to Frisk, which explains their curious connection. One more piece of evidence hinting at this is how our soul shatters when we're defeated in combat. We have a human soul, not a monster's soul, and so only our body should die when defeated. This could be done to represent Frisk losing the determination that isn't their own, rather than being Frisk actually dying, as in some sense we're already dead. You may be wondering how any of this ties into Frisk's backstory. Well, it explains how Frisk was able to find the determination to explore the underground. With this in mind, we can only assume that Frisk was extremely depressed before they met monster kind. But why? Perhaps they hated humans like Chara did, but then when we speak to Asriel in the first room, he seems to suggest that that's a trait independent to Chara. He sees us as a better person than Chara, who wouldn't be so hateful. Frisk is almost like Chara's second attempt at playing the game. This time though, they're determined to make a difference considering their previous failure. Could this explain all the strange references to Chara we encounter throughout our journey? In Waterfall, we randomly experience one of Chara's memories, namely that of Asriel meeting the child. When we die, we clearly hear the voice of Asgore telling us that the fate of humans and monsters depends on us. This can't be addressing Frisk, as Frisk hasn't even met Asgore yet. It must be yet another memory of Chara, probably the time they were poisoned by buttercups and were dying. Finally, when fighting Asriel, he first mistakes us for his former best friend. Why is this? While Frisk does share some resemblance with Chara, you'd think the yellow skin would be a dead giveaway. Meanwhile, on the genocide path, Flowey is absolutely convinced that we're Chara. To us, he seems delusional until Chara appears at the end of the game, indicating that he was right all along. We really are Chara in some way or another, most likely through the power of their soul. This may seem like it tells us nothing about Frisk, but really it tells us everything. We're being given the impression that Frisk's story doesn't matter as much as Chara's, or perhaps they're entirely intertwined. Why else did Asgore think the fate of humans and monsters depended on Chara? Perhaps he wanted to research the child's human soul, but even then that seems like quite the stretch. Meanwhile, this very literally applies in our case. We can choose whether to kill all monster kind or to set them free, putting their fate entirely in our hands. While it's difficult to explain what exactly is going on, it seems to some extent that Chara is Frisk. What exactly am I getting at then? There appears to be multiple parallels between Frisk and Chara's story, from the apparent depression to the general lack of a backstory to the appearance of the two children. The implication therefore is that Frisk came from somewhere very much the same as Chara did. It's impossible to say whether either character has had some sort of traumatic past, but for whatever reason they seem to have both been led to Mount Ebott out of depression. It could have always been for a different purpose however. Maybe Chara sought to take their own life, whereas Frisk wanted to escape the world. Whatever the case, there appears to be a great deal of synchronicity between the two, and their actions seem to be peculiar reflections of one another. While there's very few details within the game about Frisk's history and past, if Chara was still alive, they seem like someone who would be able to understand and relate to them. Instead though, many details are left blank for players to fill in. Undoubtedly so it can feel like part of the adventure, just like how Chara is in some way a part of Frisk. The human's origin is mostly ours to create, but it always inevitably rung alongside Chara's story as well. Naturally maybe Frisk was just sleepwalking through the entire thing, considering their permanently shut eyes. I hope you enjoyed this sort of amalgamation of my various theories on Frisk. I realise I only said a few new things in this video if you've watched my previous videos on the character, but I hope this cleared up a few details and explored a few new possibilities. Depending on what sort of player we are, we either readily embrace the prospect of living with the monsters, or escape them the first opportunity we're given. I imagine most people chose to stick with Toriel, regardless of where Frisk came from. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you told Toriel that you have places to go to. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. Try not to climb Mount Ebott because you're feeling a little dejected, and I'll see you next time. Before I go, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to my patrons, my head scientists Asgore and She, Cameron Vigil, Kay Jensen, Sophronius and Illumanti Gamer, and my Underlab scientists Crystal Slate, Nicholas Dux, Armin Arler, Marisa Ray, Corey Kidwell, Yushio Coroni, Sarah Wydra and Emily Gatewood. Thanks to the generosity of every name you see here, this channel is able to keep going. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out the Patreon link below, as well as the video that explains why I'd so massively appreciate your contribution.